China has responded to Trump's import taxes with a 34% retaliatory tariff on all U.S. goods entering China. One industry that could be hit hard is farming.
The announcement that China has canceled all U.S. soybean orders and intends to halt the import of additional American agricultural products marks a significant turning point in global trade relations. This dramatic shift was triggered by the newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump's imposition of sweeping tariffs on major trade partners, including China. These measures, designed to protect American industries and promote domestic manufacturing, have instead sent shockwaves through the international economic system and ignited a swift and decisive response from one of the United States' largest trading partners. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. China's decision to stop purchasing soybeans from the United States is not a trivial matter. As the world's largest importer of soybeans, China has long relied on the U.S. to meet its growing domestic demand for animal feed, cooking oil, and food processing. American soybean farmers have, in turn, depended heavily on Chinese buyers to absorb the vast output of the U.S. agricultural sector. The trade in soybeans between the two countries has been a cornerstone of agricultural commerce, representing billions of dollars in economic activity annually. The sudden collapse of this relationship threatens to disrupt the livelihoods of tens of thousands of American farmers and reverberates throughout the supply chains that support them. The decision by Chinese officials to sever this vital agricultural link was not made in isolation. It follows a calculated and deliberate strategy to counteract the effects of new U.S. tariffs, which have dramatically raised the cost of doing business with the United States. From China's perspective, continuing to buy American products under the new tariff regime would be economically unsound and politically untenable. By eliminating reliance on U.S. soybeans and other food imports, China signals a shift towards self-sufficiency and diversification of its trade relationships, aiming to insulate itself from future volatility in U.S. policy. The implications for American agriculture are immediate and severe. U.S. farmers had already been operating in a climate of uncertainty with fluctuating commodity prices, unpredictable weather patterns, and increasing input costs. The loss of their most significant export market compounds these challenges, placing additional strain on rural economies. In many Midwestern states, soybean farming is not just a business, but a way of life passed down through generations. With silos full of unsold crops and contracts abruptly canceled, farmers face financial ruin and communities risk collapse. The domestic fallout is not confined to farmers alone. A wide network of industries, from fertilizer producers and equipment manufacturers to transportation and port workers, is tethered to the agricultural sector. The sudden drop in demand for soybeans and related products sends a ripple through this network, leading to job losses, production cuts, and a contraction of local economies. Banks that service rural communities may experience rising default rates on agricultural loans, and states heavily reliant on farm revenues could see budget shortfalls, affecting public services and infrastructure investment. From a geopolitical standpoint, China's move is a powerful statement of resistance. It asserts a willingness to endure economic pain in the short term in order to assert long-term sovereignty over its trade relationships. It also challenges the assumption that the United States can leverage its economic dominance without consequence. By redirecting its import needs to countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Russia, China strengthens ties with other agricultural exporters and reduces future dependence on the U.S. This shift may lead to long-term realignments in global agricultural markets, with new trade routes and partnerships emerging from the disruption. The timing of this decision, so soon after the election of a president who campaigned on a platform of economic nationalism, adds a layer of political complexity. For the Trump administration, the tariffs were meant to correct trade imbalances and restore American manufacturing prowess. Yet the retaliatory measures taken by China expose the vulnerability of sectors not traditionally associated with trade disputes. The agricultural heartland, which overwhelmingly supported Trump's election, now finds itself on the front lines of an economic conflict it neither started nor anticipated. Chinese policymakers, for their part, are likely to use this moment to accelerate investments in domestic agriculture and food technology. With an eye toward long-term food security, China has already begun to develop alternative protein sources and expand soybean cultivation in regions such as Heilongjiang Province. Additionally, Chinese firms are increasing stakes in agricultural operations across Africa and Latin America, securing both supply chains and diplomatic goodwill. The cancellation of U.S. soybean orders, then, is as much a strategic pivot as it is a retaliatory measure. It reflects a broader ambition to decouple from volatile Western markets and assert greater control over critical commodities. The ripple effects extend beyond the immediate economic concerns. For global food security, the realignment of trade flows presents new risks and opportunities. Countries that step into the void left by the United States may experience a windfall, but also increased scrutiny and pressure to meet China's vast demand. Environmental concerns also arise, as expanded soybean production in ecologically sensitive areas, such as the Brazilian Amazon, could lead to increased deforestation and biodiversity loss. Thus, the economic reshuffling catalyzed by this trade conflict could have far-reaching consequences for sustainability and climate change efforts. At the same time, the abrupt nature of China's withdrawal from the U.S. agricultural market underscores the fragility of modern global trade. In an interconnected world, decisions made in one capital can cascade across continents in a matter of days. The interdependence that once underpinned the global economy is increasingly seen as a liability, subject to the whims of political leadership and the volatility of electoral cycles. The soybean standoff illustrates how quickly strategic alliances can be upended and highlights the need for nations to develop more resilient trade systems. For the U.S., the road ahead will likely involve efforts to find new buyers for surplus soybeans and to reorient domestic agricultural policy. The government may be forced to increase subsidies to farmers or purchase excess crops to stabilize prices. There may also be a push to expand trade with countries in Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa, though few markets can match the scale of Chinese demand. Simultaneously, American companies may accelerate automation and innovation to cut costs and remain competitive in a shrinking global marketplace. This development also places pressure on international institutions that govern trade. Organizations like the World Trade Organization, which are designed to mediate such disputes and ensure a level playing field, now find themselves sidelined as major powers resort to unilateral action. The erosion of these norms could lead to a more chaotic and fragmented global economy, where power politics outweigh cooperative mechanisms and economic efficiency is sacrificed on the altar of national interest. The cancellation of U.S. soybean orders could also become a blueprint for future trade retaliation. Should other countries face punitive tariffs or trade barriers from the United States, they may follow China's example and target specific sectors that have both economic and political significance. This weaponization of trade, while effective in the short term, may ultimately weaken the very systems that have enabled global growth and development over the past half-century. Public perception of globalization, already skeptical in many quarters, may further sour in light of these developments. As communities bear the brunt of trade wars, support for international trade agreements and open markets could wane. This may lead to a resurgence of protectionism not just in the United States, but around the world. In such an environment, collaboration becomes harder, innovation slows, and the spirit of global cooperation is replaced by zero-sum competition. Amid all this, there is the human element, the farmers waking up to canceled contracts, the workers laid off from processing plants, the small towns bracing for economic decline. Their stories will shape the political narrative in the years to come. Many of these individuals placed their faith in a vision of American greatness rooted in economic self-reliance and renegotiated trade deals. Confronted with the unintended consequences of that vision, they now face a stark choice: adapt to a new global reality or push for a reversal of the policies that brought them to this point. The broader lesson emerging from China's move is the importance of balance in economic policymaking. While protecting domestic industries is a legitimate goal, doing so in a manner that alienates key partners can lead to self-inflicted harm. Trade is not merely a transaction of goods, but a web of relationships that support stability, growth, and peace. Severing one strand may not collapse the entire structure, but enough disruptions can render it unrecognizable. As soybeans sit unsold in warehouses and shipping containers remain idle on docks, the consequences of a trade policy driven by confrontation rather than cooperation are plain to see. The global marketplace is more than a battleground for economic supremacy. It is a shared space that requires trust, predictability, and mutual benefit. China's cancellation of U.S. soybean orders serves as a cautionary tale of what happens when that trust is broken. The implications of this moment are vast and complex. It is not just about agriculture or trade, it is about power, priorities, and the kind of world we wish to build. Will nations continue down the path of economic nationalism, bracing for conflict and disruption, or will they rediscover the value of collaboration, negotiation, and long-term partnership? The answers to these questions will shape the contours of global commerce for decades to come. In the wake of China's unprecedented decision to cancel all U.S. soybean orders and begin a phased withdrawal from importing other American agricultural products, global economic centers began recalibrating their expectations of trade dynamics. While the shockwaves were first felt in the soybean market, the broader implications of China's shift away from American food imports touch every corner of global trade policy, international relations, and long-term strategic planning. The move is not an isolated reaction, but a key signal in a larger recalibration of China's international economic strategy, and it reshapes not just agricultural markets but the architecture of bilateral trade itself. From a macroeconomic perspective, China's pivot serves as a watershed moment in the ongoing evolution of multipolar trade networks. No longer bound by a dependency on any one supplier, especially the U.S., Beijing appears committed to accelerating its strategic decoupling from Western economies. The country's burgeoning middle class and rapidly modernizing economy demand an immense and consistent inflow of food products, especially protein-rich crops like soybeans. By shifting import preferences to countries outside the U.S. sphere of influence, China minimizes political vulnerability while diversifying risk. Brazil, already a major soybean exporter to China, is poised to increase its dominance in that space. Simultaneously, smaller producers such as Paraguay and Ukraine may rise in prominence as Beijing nurtures new alliances and spreads its procurement strategy more broadly. But the implications extend beyond sourcing. China's withdrawal forces a reevaluation of logistical and infrastructural systems. Ports previously optimized for U.S. shipping lanes are likely to be reoriented toward new trading partners. Investment in cold storage, grain silos, and intermodal transport corridors will shift accordingly. This strategic reorientation isn't merely economic, it's geographic. It changes where capital is deployed, which infrastructure is prioritized, and where long-term food security agreements are negotiated. The Belt and Road Initiative may evolve to support new trade routes for agricultural goods, embedding food logistics deeper into China's long-term geopolitical vision. On the technological front, China's decision marks a turning point in how it approaches agricultural self-sufficiency. For decades, China has balanced its rapidly expanding urban needs with the limitations of domestic farmland. Now, backed by aggressive government investment, there is a surge in precision agriculture, gene-edited crops, vertical farming, and AI-driven yield management systems. State-backed firms are acquiring foreign agritech companies, securing patents, and forming research partnerships with nations aligned more closely with Chinese interests. The move away from U.S. imports isn't simply about avoiding tariffs. It reflects a deeper desire to innovate past dependency. Simultaneously, the Chinese public's perception of food sourcing is likely to be subtly influenced by this policy pivot. With the government controlling most media narratives, the move can be framed domestically as a push for national strength and agricultural independence. Rather than appearing as a reaction to U.S. tariffs, the decision is more likely to be presented as a proactive strategy rooted in sovereignty, food safety, and sustainability. This fosters a sense of national pride, while reducing any potential public backlash over changes in food sourcing or slight increases in food prices during the transition period. For the Global South, particularly countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, the new Chinese stance offers both a rare opportunity and a cautionary tale. On one hand, there is an opening to deepen agricultural exports to the world's second-largest economy. On the other hand, these nations must also consider how heavily to commit to a trading relationship that can shift rapidly based on geopolitical maneuvering. Countries previously overshadowed by the U.S.-China agricultural relationship now find themselves courted by Beijing, prompting a new wave of competition for market access, certification standards, and regulatory harmonization. American agribusiness, long structured around the predictability of Chinese demand, faces a complex web of challenges. Scaling down operations to match decreased export volumes is not a simple task in an industry built on high fixed costs and large-scale production. Land use planning, crop rotation schedules, labor supply, and machinery investments are all long-term decisions. The overnight loss of the largest customer creates an imbalance that cannot be addressed through simple redirection. Emerging markets in Africa or South Asia may hold promise, but they lack the infrastructure, purchasing power, or scale to absorb the sudden glut of U.S. produce. The financial markets are not insulated from this disruption either. Commodity traders have already seen volatility spike as futures prices react to uncertainty in demand. Risk analysts at major banks and hedge funds now face the unenviable task of revaluating long-term positions based on entirely new global trade flows. Insurance companies that underwrite agricultural investments must adjust their exposure models, and institutional investors with holdings in farmland REITs, machinery manufacturers, and agrochemical firms must reassess risk and return profiles across portfolios. In Washington, this new trade rupture catalyzes an intense political debate. While the administration holds fast to its tariff-driven approach, internal dissent begins to emerge. Lawmakers from rural states face mounting pressure from constituents demanding immediate relief. Emergency aid packages, crop insurance adjustments, and expanded USDA buybacks become central topics on Capitol Hill. Bipartisan tensions rise as legislators from both parties clash over the merits and consequences of tariff diplomacy, while lobbying groups scramble to influence the next round of policy decisions. Trade representatives and diplomats, caught between the administration's rhetoric and the economic fallout, are left trying to repair frayed alliances while articulating a coherent path forward. Meanwhile, multilateral trade agreements and regional trade blocs take on heightened importance. Countries left reeling from the breakdown of U.S.-China agricultural trade increasingly look to arrangements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, Mercosur, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, for stability and access. These frameworks, once seen as secondary to bilateral trade deals, now emerge as critical avenues for ensuring supply chain resilience and market access. American food security also becomes a topic of renewed debate. The traditional focus has been on abundance and affordability. Now there's growing attention to economic sustainability and the risks of over-reliance on a narrow export model. Some policymakers propose rethinking how food is produced and consumed domestically, encouraging more local consumption of crops like soybeans, diversifying production toward higher-margin specialty crops, or increasing biofuel use to absorb excess supply. The conversation extends into academia, think tanks, and grassroots movements advocating for a more regionalized and equitable food system. Internationally, other countries observe the U.S.-China trade rupture with growing concern. Allies of the U.S., particularly in Europe and East Asia, must weigh the risks of siding with a trade partner willing to unilaterally disrupt key industries. At the same time, they remain cautious of deepening dependencies on China, which has demonstrated a readiness to withdraw from strategic trade relationships when politically advantageous. This recalibration leads to new diplomatic efforts aimed at stabilizing trade through diversification, innovation, and resilience building. In the private sector, food corporations that once relied on stable trade lanes between the U.S. and China are now forced to reevaluate their supply chains. Some companies are moving processing facilities closer to other Asian markets, hoping to benefit from proximity to new centers of demand. Others are exploring alternative ingredients or investing in vertical integration to gain control over more aspects of production. These shifts come at a significant cost and underscore the fragility of global agribusiness models in an era of political unpredictability. The cultural impact, though more subtle, is no less important. Food has always been more than sustenance. It's deeply tied to national identity, history, and cultural exchange. The abrupt cancellation of soybean orders by China doesn't just mark an economic break, but also a symbolic one. It represents a narrowing of the channels through which two of the world's most influential nations have historically interacted on a human level. Agricultural exports, often overlooked in discussions of foreign policy, have long been a quiet but crucial form of soft power. Their absence signals a withdrawal from mutual reliance that once served as a stabilizing force. In the academic and research communities, the new trade landscape prompts urgent studies and policy modeling. Economists develop new simulations to understand the long-term effects of decoupling between major powers. Agricultural scientists intensify their efforts to create crops better suited for alternative markets. Geopolitical analysts dig deeper into the implications of food sovereignty as a tool for leverage and resistance. What once seemed like abstract speculation, the weaponization of food trade, is now a concrete reality that demands a new intellectual framework. Environmental concerns are pushed into sharper focus as production shifts to meet the changing geography of demand. Brazil's Amazon, already under pressure, may see further expansion of soybean cultivation with all the attendant environmental costs. Pesticide use, water management, and carbon emissions become part of the debate, especially as international NGOs and climate activists raise the alarm. Governments face mounting pressure to ensure that the realignment of trade does not lead to ecological devastation. Within China, this shift also creates new power centers. Agricultural cooperatives, logistics firms, and provincial governments all jostle for influence and funding as Beijing rolls out its new food strategy. Some provinces may gain in stature by producing more domestically or hosting new import hubs, while others may lose relevance in the new model. This internal redistribution of power could affect the national political landscape in ways that are yet unclear. Culturally, the decision may be leveraged by the Chinese government to promote narratives of resilience, independence, and pride. Domestic campaigns that emphasize Chinese grown for Chinese tables could become commonplace. School curricula, state media, and public policy could all reflect a concerted effort to encourage citizens to support domestic agricultural initiatives, mirroring similar nationalist agricultural movements seen in other parts of the world during periods of economic tension. For U.S. foreign policy, the development complicates diplomatic engagements beyond just China. Allies and partners who may have been negotiating trade agreements with the U.S. must now question the stability of those arrangements. If one administration can provoke such a massive economic shift through unilateral tariffs, how safe are long-term trade agreements under future governments? The credibility of the U.S. as a stable and predictable trade partner comes under scrutiny, potentially weakening its influence on the global stage. China's cancellation of soybean orders and larger disengagement from U.S. food imports thus marks far more than a transactional shift. It is a moment of strategic clarity in an increasingly unpredictable world. The ramifications reach into economics, politics, society, and the environment. It is a bold declaration of independence from one of the most powerful economies on Earth, and a test of how the United States and the world will respond to a trade order no longer governed by the rules of mutual benefit, but by the imperatives of geopolitical power. The decision by China to cancel all soybean orders from the United States and begin systematically phasing out other food imports from the country represents a profound departure from decades of interlinked economic cooperation. As this economic divorce proceeds, a vast ecosystem of stakeholders, sectors, and nations is being reshaped in its wake. With each canceled shipment and unsigned contract, the implications reach further into the machinery of global commerce, altering the trajectory of food politics, technological priorities, and the geopolitical influence of food-producing nations. As the United States grapples with the vacuum left by China's abrupt market exit, a new front opens in the global race for agricultural influence. Countries that were previously marginal players in the grain and oilseed markets are emerging as potential alternatives. Nations such as India, Serbia, and Ethiopia are beginning to invest in agricultural infrastructure, not merely to satisfy domestic needs, but to potentially enter China's vast and hungry marketplace. These smaller economies are studying the breakdown of US-China trade ties and positioning themselves as future suppliers, leaner, more flexible, and politically non-aligned. In this evolving trade architecture, currency also becomes a central factor. As China moves away from dollar-denominated contracts with the United States, It further incentivizes trading partners to accept the yuan or other alternative currencies. This weakens the global dominance of the US dollar in agricultural trade and accelerates the use of digital currencies, bilateral swap agreements, and local tender exchanges. Central banks in emerging economies are watching closely, considering the implications for monetary sovereignty, inflation control, and trade balance adjustments. The insurance and financial hedging industries are also undergoing significant transformations. With traditional futures markets heavily disrupted by the absence of predictable Chinese demand, there is a vacuum in the mechanisms used to stabilize prices and manage risk. Alternative markets are emerging to fill this gap, driven by innovations in blockchain tracking, climate-based pricing indexes, and AI-driven predictive analytics. These new systems seek to provide more localized, resilient financial instruments that are less vulnerable to sudden geopolitical shocks. While attention has centered on soybean farmers and large-scale producers, the ripple effects of the trade disruption are acutely felt among smaller, independent food producers in the United States. Specialty grain growers, niche organic operations, and cooperative farms that had just begun to tap into Chinese markets through boutique food platforms are now watching those doors close. These producers, who often lack the lobbying power or financial buffers of agribusiness giants, are forced to redirect their limited resources towards smaller, fragmented domestic markets, or attempt to establish costly export pipelines to secondary countries. Universities and agricultural extension services across the U.S. are now tasked with guiding a fundamental redirection of farming strategies. Curricula in agricultural economics are rapidly being updated to reflect the new global realities. Farm management programs are shifting emphasis toward crop diversification, regenerative agriculture, and direct-to-consumer models. Students who once expected to graduate into a stable, globally connected system are now being trained to become adaptive entrepreneurs, able to pivot quickly in a volatile trade landscape. China's disengagement also triggers a domino effect in bilateral trade relations beyond just food. With agriculture historically serving as a stabilizing counterbalance in US-China relations, its removal opens the door to greater volatility across other sectors, including semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and rare earth minerals. Negotiations in these areas now lack the calming presence of a mutually beneficial agricultural dialogue, raising the stakes in all subsequent diplomatic engagements. Moreover, the psychological dimension of this realignment on both sides of the Pacific is profound. In China, the policy reinforces a narrative of strength, self-reliance, and forward momentum. In the United States, it exacerbates a growing sense of economic isolationism and decline, especially in rural areas. The symbolic weight of losing such a massive market becomes a reflection of broader anxieties around America's shifting place in the global order. Political strategists, media outlets, and cultural commentators begin to embed these themes into the national discourse, influencing electoral behavior and shaping the ideological battles of the coming years. Global shipping companies, especially those that specialized in trans-Pacific agricultural freight, are also forced to adapt. Routes optimized for bulk shipments from the American Midwest to Chinese ports are seeing declining volumes. In response, logistics firms are redesigning maritime and rail connections to support new export corridors from South America and Eastern Europe. These shifts are not merely commercial, they bring environmental consequences as well. Longer routes, different fuel consumption patterns, and altered supply chain timetables contribute to evolving carbon footprints and logistical efficiencies. Technology providers serving the agricultural sector are also facing an inflection point. Many American ag-tech startups and established equipment manufacturers design products and services around high-volume, export-oriented monoculture farming. With that model under stress, companies are reconsidering product design, target customers, and distribution models. There is a move toward more modular, scalable technology platforms that can serve smaller, diversified farms operating in uncertain markets. Digital platforms facilitating farm-to-market transactions, crop tracking, and compliance reporting are seeing increased demand as producers look to mitigate the unpredictability introduced by geopolitical shocks. From a legal perspective, trade lawyers and international arbitration experts are entering a new era of complexity. Existing trade agreements, insurance clauses, and supply chain contracts are being tested like never before. Force majeure claims rise as companies argue that governmental action has rendered previously enforceable obligations impossible. Legal firms specializing in international trade law experience a surge in demand as exporters and buyers alike seek to restructure contracts to provide more flexible exit clauses and jurisdictional protections in a volatile trade environment. In China, domestic agricultural reform is being accelerated to accommodate the supply gap left by reduced imports. Policy initiatives include increasing subsidies for domestic soybean farmers, incentivizing land consolidation to enable more industrial-scale production, and investing in irrigation and soil enhancement programs. As these reforms take root, new domestic champions in China's agricultural sector are likely to emerge. State-owned enterprises and regional farming cooperatives that become central nodes in a newly autonomous food supply chain. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on China canceling US soybean and food orders? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.